Well, today, in today's world, one of the hot new movie series, or not new, they've been around for a while, are the Marvel Studios series. Whether it's Captain America or Black Panther or Ant-Man, all of these movies share a common thread, even though they're different. And the common thread is that a normal, average-looking person possesses beneath them or inside of them another identity that enables them to become a hero and meet a challenge that can only be conquered by this special identity that they possess. I don't know who your favorite Marvel studio person is, but I was just reflecting on all of them while I was watching Ant-Man the other day. I'm not necessarily an Ant-Man guy, I'm probably more of a Black Panther guy, but I was just sort of tracing this common thread of this capacity of these seemingly normal-looking people to possess a deeper, heroic identity that they need to be transformed into to meet their challenges. And I was thinking that these have an awful lot to do with today's passage. Today's passage, we're going to study something called the Transfiguration. It was that moment where Jesus was transfigured and his divine identity was revealed not only to himself, but to Peter, James, and John, who witnessed it. And we're going to preach on that. And one of the things I love about ChurchOne, and one of the things that we do here, is that we follow what's called the liturgical calendar. And the liturgical calendar brings us around every year to certain themes and topics. And this Sunday happens to be Transfiguration Sunday. And one of the things I love about it is we're going to come around to this every year. And so that frees all of us up as preachers and even as listeners to feel like we have to mine everything about the story and instead just listen and find different angles on the story. We don't have to cover all the scope and significance of it, but it gives us an opportunity to delve into it from different angles. And this year, I want to look at this picture of transfiguration, this metamorphosis, this identity revelation of who Jesus was to Peter, James, and John, really through the eyes of Peter. Because Peter, we all know, was a leader, one of the early disciples, but Peter, probably of most of the disciples, is eminently relatable to all of us. And one of the reasons that he's relatable to all of us is that Peter makes mistakes. He makes mistakes. He's impulsive. He acts. He talks before he thinks. He does all sorts of things that most of us can relate to in our spiritual lives. And Peter's mistakes are really a part of this transfiguration story. Obviously, they're not the big, massive story, but they're a part of this story. And I hope by the time I'm done, you'll see why those mistakes are important for us to see and reflect on. So I want to read the Transfiguration story. This year we'll be reading it out of the Gospel of Mark. And I want us to focus on three things as we reflect on it. One, the great thing about mistakes. Number two, we're going to look at Peter's mistakes. And lastly, we're going to look at God's answer. So Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 13, and I'll be reading from the New International Version. It says this: after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant, and they asked him, why did the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him." Well, again, I want to look at three things. And again, I'm taking this story of the Transfiguration, which is a big, massive part of the Scriptures. And I want to just look at from the angle of Peter, in particular, Peter's mistakes. And the first thing I want to talk about is the great things about mistakes. I had a friend that was in the granite business and it installed granite countertops and all that, granite and stone countertops and all that kind of stuff. It was a good business, but one of the kind of challenges of that business is that mistakes are costly. You measure something just a little wrong, you get a cut wrong, you drop something, you can cause big damage and cost a lot of money pretty quickly. I remember one time he asked me to help him out, and we went to a granite factory, and we had to take a big slab of granite for a job that he was doing, and we had to move it from the factory floor, and it had to stand on this forklift that lifted us up 3 stories to unload it into another part of the building. And he asked me to help him, and as I was standing on the forklift with the big slab of granite, he was saying, "Be careful," and I don't know what he was more concerned about, myself falling off or the granite itself. Was he more worried about dropping? But so it was a kind of business where mistakes are costly, and he used to have a phrase that he would utter sometimes when things would go wrong with certain jobs. When something would go wrong and the job wouldn't work out and it would cost him a lot more time and money than he expected, he would say, "Man, I paid a lot of tuition on that job. My mistakes cost me time and money. I paid a lot of tuition." And I used to love that phrase because nobody likes mistakes. They're frustrating, they're embarrassing, they're confusing, they create complications for us. Oftentimes they cost us money and time. But like my friend was pointing out when he used that word tuition, he says, mistakes are actually a great way to learn. We learn a lot from our mistakes. Over Christmas, I got a new grill. I got one of these grills called a Big Green Egg. And I like to grill out and cook things, and the Big Green Egg sort of enables me to cook things I couldn't cook before, like ribs. And so I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos, learning how to cook ribs on the Big Green Egg. And one of the guys that on the video had a great line. He said, "You know, the best way to make good ribs is to make a lot of bad ribs." And I can completely concur. As I've been stumbling around trying to figure this grill out and try to make ribs, I have made some bad ribs, you know. I'll miss a step here in the production. I'll overcook them. I don't quite understand exactly how to do it. I think I do, but then I go and I make mistakes. And do I like making bad ribs? No, I don't. Have I made good ribs? Not yet. But here's the deal. I'm learning. Mistakes can be a good thing because they help us learn. In the same way, we can make mistakes with our faith. We can have a wrong picture of who God is. We can mistakenly assume things about God that we shouldn't assume. We can overestimate ourselves and our level of faith and our level of spiritual maturity. And we can think we know things and are capable of things that we're really not. And we can actually learn from these things. We can learn from our mistakes. Peter made mistakes here, and he had to learn. Well, what were the mistakes that Peter made? The essence of Peter's mistakes are what we see in verse 5 and 6 of this passage. After again experiencing and witnessing this transformation, after being selectively chosen by Jesus to come up for this moment, he observes a transformation, and it says in the text that they were frightened, you know? And I'd imagine we all would be frightened by something like that. But Peter's response was this. He said, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And it's pretty clear that this wasn't the right move to make in that moment. In fact, we're going to talk about God's response a little bit later on. But I love in the transformation account in Matthew, it talks about Peter's response to this moment, and it says he says, like, "Rabbi, we can we can do this, we can build these things. And in Matthew it says this, and while Peter was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them up. In a sense, Peter's first mistake was a temperamental one. He talked too much. He talked too much. One of the best ways, one of the best kind of differences in temperament are these ideas of introversion and extroversion. Introverts like to think to talk, and extroverts talk to think. And probably one of the good ways to tell if you're an introvert or an extrovert is figuring out how you feel about the question, how are you? Most introverts don't really like the question too often, how are you? Because they think that when you ask them that question, they think, man, now I need to think about an answer. How am I doing? I need to think about it, and then I need to tell you about it. Versus an extrovert loves the question, how are you? Because they'll just start talking and keep talking until they figure out how they're doing. And Peter is a raging extrovert. He's watching all this, and it says that they're afraid, and his reaction to try to figure out what's going on is to just start talking. And he talked too much. I remember when my son Matt was like 4 years old, and he had a cousin over who was just talking all the time, and it just sort of exasperated. At one point, Matt said, as a little 4-year-old, he said, "You don't have to tell me everything." And that's, very often, sometimes we react to moments and we talk too much. And I think Peter temperamentally sort of made the mistake of talking too much. But there's more to this passage than just temperamental mistakes. I think Peter actually is also making a fundamentally theological mistake that is more important. Because his response is, hey, we'll build 3 shelters, 3 booths, or 3 tents, depending on what your passage means. And these are all basically just sort of like religious markers or statues. And Peter is experiencing this great mystical moment. And so his response is like, well, let's do something religious. Let's build a little sanctuary. Let's kind of do something to mark this moment. And practically speaking, it probably wasn't, the best instantaneous reaction. I mean, here you've just witnessed Jesus glorified, revealing his divine identity, that he's the Son of God. You see him talking with these 2 historic Old Testament figures, Moses and Elijah, which is linking Jesus to the law and the prophets, not saying Jesus, didn't care about those things. It's linking together these great themes. And even more importantly, he's talking to Moses and Elijah, and they're alive and they're talking, which is proof that there's a resurrection and a life beyond this life. There's profound truth being revealed in this encounter, and what Peter is witnessing, and his reaction is just some type of booth, and to build it on some obscure mountain where nobody would be. It's probably he's trying to take this great truth and he's trying to be religious about it. I'm not sure that was the best reaction, but even more so than that, the biggest problem, I think, in Peter's response is he says, let's build 3 shelters. Let's build 3 monuments. Almost like he's going to say, let's build a Mount Rushmore, and we'll have Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, and then probably Teddy Roosevelt. You ever wonder why Roosevelt got his monument up there? It's probably because he was the president that paid for it. But kind of, hey, let's build a Mount Rushmore, put Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, and all 3 of you will be together as these great religious figures. And Peter is making a big fundamental theological mistake that I think we all get tempted to make. It's the mistake of syncretism. It's trying to link together all of these religious figures and kind of say, hey, they're all kind of valid options and choices. I understand the temptation Peter has, and I understand the temptation today. We want to be synchronistic. We don't like thinking of Jesus as unique or special or fundamentally different than any other religious figure. It seems arrogant and insensitive and intolerant in our world. And it's very tempting to be synchronistic about our faith. And it creates all sorts of questions. Well, why is Jesus so unique? And what about people in the world who don't believe in Jesus? What happens to them? And these are all important and challenging and difficult questions. And very often those questions make us want to be synchronistic about our faith and just make Jesus one of many options. And I would certainly say this, being bigoted and intolerant is just as big a mistake as being syncretizing Jesus with other figures. So the answer isn't to go to the other side and be bigoted and intolerant. But this is ultimately a theological question of truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And Peter sort of mistakes him for one of many options, and that's not really the answer God's looking for. In fact, that's one of Peter's fundamental mistakes, I think, in this. And so Peter makes two mistakes that I'm identifying. One, temperamental, he talks too much, and the second, theological, he sort of lumps Jesus in with all these other religious figures. And that's what I think makes sense of God's answer to us, or to Peter, and then to us by extension. Because his first answer is really to Peter's temperament. He says, because remember, God responds to Peter's comment about building these shelters, and he responds in this way in verse 7. He says, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." This is one of only 2 times that God speaks directly in the Gospels. And here he says, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." And first, he's responding to Peter and his desire to talk, and he's saying, "Peter, listen. Listen." Peter makes a mistake a lot of us make when it comes to our faith. We think the answer is to do something first, that this is how we prove our faith, by doing something. And there's nothing wrong with doing stuff, but you need to do stuff in the right way and in the right order. Ed, I think, rightly talks about ChurchOne as an abiding church. We're a church that's not just trying to get ahead of God and to sort of just move ahead and just fill ourselves with activities to prove something. But instead, we're trying to look to and listen to God and to follow His plans and His directions in His time and in His way. We're not saying we do it perfectly here at ChurchOne, but we really do try to abide and listen first instead of act like Peter did here. And I think the goal is not to be impulsively religious, but abidingly active. And Peter's sort of temperament leads him into this mistake, and God says, slow down and listen. Dale Bruner puts it this way. He said, spiritual leadership is not doing for Jesus, but letting Jesus speak and doing what He says. Peter has a lot of great characteristics, but he probably had to learn this lesson the hard way, that the goal is to not just do for Jesus, but let Jesus speak and do what He says. And this mistake taught him that, I believe. But God doesn't just respond to Peter's temperamental mistake. He responds to Peter's theological mistake. Because in this answer, again, where he says, "This is my beloved son, listen to him," in verse 7, part of what he's doing, I think, is correcting Peter's theological syncretism, Peter's desire to build a Mount Rushmore of biblical figures and to put Jesus up there as one of the options. And particularly, I think there are 3 essential things in God's answer to Peter that a good biblically aware Jewish person would recognize. There's 3 allusions from the Old Testament in this simple answer God gives to Peter that are significant, that I think a good Old Testament aware person, they wouldn't have called it the Old Testament then, it would have just been the Hebrew Scriptures that they knew, would have been aware of the depth of what God is saying. The first is when He says, "This is my son." This is an allusion to Psalm 2, verse 7. Psalm 2 is what they call a messianic psalm. It's a psalm describing this character, this figure of a Messiah that would be God's anointed one to come and lead His people. And this Messiah was going to be someone unique and special who had a unique relationship to God. In Psalm 2, verse 7, the Messiah is described as God's son, my son, a unique relationship to God. And not only that, King David would call the Son of God my Lord. So the great king, the greatest king in Israel, would recognize the great kingship of this Messiah who is the Son of God. Whoever this person was, the Hebrew people would know, would be an incredibly unique person, unlike anyone else, even unlike Elijah and Moses and David. This Messiah would be a unique person. And that person is special and not just one of many options. Secondly, that phrase, listen to him. A listener of the Hebrew scripture would recognize an allusion there to Deuteronomy 18, where Moses, the great leader of Israel, the first great leader of the nation, would describe that after Moses one day would come this great prophet. And this prophet would lead God's people, and this prophet would be a unique person in the history of Israel. And one of the things that Moses implores people when that prophet comes is to listen to him. Listen to him. And so that phrase, listen to him, is an allusion to the prophetic ministry of Jesus and the unique prophetic ministry that Jesus is, in fact, the great prophet of Israel that Moses spoke of in Deuteronomy 18. But lastly, tucked in the middle of these allusions to the Old Testament, in between, this is my son and listen to him, is my beloved son. The literal Greek is the one whom I love, my beloved. Here again, in that phrase, if you hear that phrase, it would hearken you back to Genesis chapter 22, the story of Abraham called to sacrifice Isaac. And when God calls Abraham to make this sacrifice of his son, God says this, take your son Isaac, the one whom you love. Take your beloved son and offer him as a sacrifice. Now, ultimately, Abraham does not have to offer his beloved son Isaac as a sacrifice. But God the Father has to offer his son Jesus as a sacrifice. God the Father goes through and does what Abraham did not have to do. Why? He offered Jesus as a sacrifice for us to pay the penalty that only the perfect one could pay for our sins. Why did he do it? He did it to show us just how deeply loved we are. And why did he do it? To show us that there is a way through the sting of sin and death. Only Jesus could do that. Someone this unique, this amazing, this powerful, this loving is not someone you want to make the mistake of missing and sort of mixing in with everybody else and one of many great options. Peter ultimately had to learn the unique character and who Jesus was. He ultimately did not make the mistake of missing Jesus. And I hope you don't either. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for your grace and for your mercy. I thank you that even in our imperfect faith, you long to meet us. You long to show yourself to us, even in our mistakes. Lord, would you reveal to us again in a fresh way just who you are and how much you love us, that we may find strength and peace and hope, and we may live lives that bring you glory. It's in your name and for your sake we ask these things. Amen. Well, God bless you, ChurchOne. Have a great Transfiguration Sunday.